She brought her 5-year-old daughter to the most important job interview of her life, not knowing the billionaire CEO had lost his own child years ago. When the little girl spoke 3 simple words, they shattered a wall around his heart that money could never rebuild. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Community Center's job placement office cast harsh shadows across Maria Rodriguez's weathered hands as she filled out her 15th application this month. At 32, she had mastered the art of making herself small, of folding her dreams into neat, manageable pieces that fit inside the margins of government forms. The plastic chair creaked under her slight frame as she checked boxes that reduced her life to statistics. Single mother, high school education, unemployed for 8 months. Each mark felt like a small surrender, another step away from the woman she'd once imagined becoming. Beside her, 5-year-old Sophie Rodriguez sat quietly on the floor, her dark curls falling across her face as she carefully colored inside the lines of a donated coloring book. The little girl had learned early that Mama's job-hunting days required silence, patience, and the ability to make herself invisible when the grown-ups talked about situations and circumstances. Next, called Mrs. Henderson from behind the metal desk, her voice carrying the weary authority of someone who'd processed hundreds of desperate cases. The nameplate before her read, Patricia Henderson, Employment Coordinator, but Maria had learned to read the exhaustion behind the title. Maria gathered her folder of carefully photocopied certificates and references, each document representing a small hope that someone might see her value beyond her current circumstances. Sophie dutifully closed her coloring book and tucked the worn crayons back into their box, movements precise despite her young age. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Mrs. Henderson said, without looking up from her computer screen, "I see you've been coming here for several months. Customer service, retail, office assistant positions." Her fingers clicked across the keyboard with mechanical efficiency. "Unfortunately, most employers are looking for recent experience." The words hit Maria like familiar punches, each one landing exactly where previous rejections had created tender spots. Recent experience, as if the 8 months she'd spent caring for her dying mother while raising Sophie alone had somehow erased the 5 years she'd worked at Miller's department store before it closed. "I understand," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But I'm a quick learner, and I'm reliable. I just need someone to give me a chance." Mrs. Henderson finally looked up, her expression softening slightly as she took in Maria's carefully pressed blouse, the same white shirt she wore to every interview, washed by hand each night and dried over the radiator in their studio apartment. "Maria, you're clearly dedicated, but without current references or updated skills." She trailed off, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like a verdict. Sophie tugged gently on Maria's skirt, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Mama, can we go see the ducks after?" The question referred to their weekly ritual of walking through Riverside Park, where they'd sit by the pond and share a single apple while Sophie told elaborate stories about the ducks' secret lives. It was free entertainment that felt like luxury, when your monthly budget was calculated in grocery store coupons and late notices. "Of course, Mija," Maria whispered back, smoothing Sophie's hair with the automatic tenderness of a mother who'd learned to find joy in small moments. Mrs. Henderson watched the interaction with something that might have been sympathy. "Actually, Maria, there is one possibility. It's a long shot, probably not what you're looking for, but..." She pulled a different folder from her desk drawer. "Sterling Global Enterprises is conducting interviews for executive assistant positions this week." Maria's pulse quickened. Sterling Global was the kind of company she'd only read about in newspapers. The corporate giant that owned half the commercial real estate in the city, with headquarters that scraped the sky like a glass and steel monument to success. The pay would be substantial, Mrs. Henderson continued, but they're looking for candidates with advanced degrees, executive experience, multiple language skills. She glanced at Maria's application again, clearly seeing the gaps between requirement and reality. I speak Spanish and English fluently, Maria offered, grasping at the possibility. And I taught myself basic computer skills at the library. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew conflicted. She'd been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between realistic hope and cruel fantasy. Maria, these aren't entry-level positions. They're looking for people who've managed corporate offices, handled confidential information, worked with high-profile executives. The rejection was gentle but firm, wrapped in the kind of professional kindness that somehow hurt worse than outright dismissal. Maria felt the familiar weight of invisible barriers, the unspoken requirements that had nothing to do with ability and everything to do with circumstance. "What if I just applied anyway?" Maria asked, surprising herself with the boldness. "The worst they can do is say no." Mrs. Henderson studied her for a long moment, seeing something in Maria's expression that gave her pause. Maybe it was the quiet desperation that came from watching your options narrow to a single thread. Maybe it was the way Sophie sat so patiently, already learning that life required endless waiting in uncomfortable chairs. "The interview process is intensive," Mrs. Henderson warned. "Panel interviews, background checks, professional references from executive-level positions. And Maria, I have to be honest, they've never hired anyone without a college degree." Maria's hand instinctively found Sophie's small fingers, drawing strength from the trusting grip of her daughter's palm. She thought about the notices piling up on their kitchen table, the conversations with the landlord that grew more strained. Each month, the way Sophie had stopped asking for things because she'd learned that wanting hurt Mama's eyes. "Could you at least give me the application?" Maria asked quietly. "Let me decide if it's worth trying." Something in her tone made Mrs. Henderson reach into the folder and extract a thick packet of papers. The Sterling Global logo gleamed from the header, elegant silver lettering that seemed to mock the fluorescent lighting of the community center. "The interviews are this Thursday," Mrs. Henderson said, sliding the application across the desk. "But Maria, these people, they live in a different world. They won't understand your situation, and they won't make allowances for it." Maria accepted the packet with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of the papers feeling disproportionate to their actual mass. Maybe they need to understand different situations. As they walked toward the exit, Sophie skipped beside her mother, unaware that the papers in Maria's folder represented either their salvation or another exercise in futility. The afternoon sun slanted through the community center's windows, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to dance around their footsteps. "Mama," Sophie said as they reached the door, "what's an interview?" Maria paused, considering how to explain the concept to a 5-year-old. "It's when you meet new people and tell them about all the good things you can do. Like when you tell me about helping Mrs. Chen with her groceries or reading to the baby next door." Sophie nodded solemnly, processing this information with the seriousness she applied to all adult concepts. "Are you going to tell them you make the best bedtime stories in the whole world?" The innocence of the question brought tears to Maria's eyes. The way children saw value in things that never appeared on resumes or job applications. Sophie didn't know that bedtime stories weren't marketable skills, that love and creativity and resilience couldn't be quantified in salary negotiations. "Maybe I will," Maria replied, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. That evening, after Sophie was asleep in their shared bed, Maria sat at their small kitchen table under the single overhead light, reading through the Sterling Global application with growing amazement and dismay. The questions seemed designed for a different species entirely. People who attended Harvard Business School, spoke 4 languages, managed million-dollar budgets, and spent their vacations in European capitals. Describe your experience managing executive-level communications and confidential correspondence. Detail your proficiency with advanced financial software and enterprise management systems. Provide examples of your success in high-pressure, multinational, or corporate environments. Each question felt like a door closing, another confirmation that she was reaching for something impossibly beyond her grasp. But as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet sounds of their modest life, the hum of the old refrigerator, the distant murmur of television through thin walls, Sophie's gentle breathing from the next room, Maria felt something unexpected rising in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly, because hope required some reasonable expectation of success. It was something fiercer and more desperate, the recognition that she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. She began writing her answers in the careful handwriting she'd perfected through years of filling out forms, each letter shaped with the precision of someone who understood that presentation mattered when you had little else to offer. Where the application asked for executive experience, she wrote about managing the household budget with mathematical precision, turning food stamps into nutritious meals, coordinating Sophie's school and medical appointments while working retail hours. Where it requested examples of handling confidential information, she described maintaining the trust of elderly customers at Miller's department store, keeping track of their personal preferences and family situations, becoming a reliable constant in their lives. For the question about high-pressure environments, Maria wrote about working double shifts while 8 months pregnant, covering for absent co-workers while fighting morning sickness, maintaining professional composure while her personal world crumbled around her. The words flowed onto the pages like water, finding its level, carrying truths that had never been valued in professional settings. She wasn't writing the answers they expected, but she was writing the only answers she had, honest, raw, and rooted in a kind of strength that couldn't be taught in business schools. When she finished, long past midnight, Maria read through her responses with a mixture of pride and terror. She told her story without apology, presented her life without shame, claimed her worth despite every message society had sent about her value. Thursday morning would come, whether she submitted the application or not. Sophie would wake up hungry, regardless of whether Maria chose courage or safety. The bills would demand payment, whether she reached for impossible dreams or accepted reasonable limitations. But as Maria sealed the application in its envelope, she realized she'd already won something important. For the first time in months, she'd written about herself as someone worthy of opportunity rather than deserving of charity. She'd claimed space in a world that had repeatedly told her she didn't belong. Sophie stirred in the next room, murmuring softly in her sleep, and Maria felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had carried her through every impossible day since becoming a mother. Whatever happened Thursday, she would face it knowing she'd tried everything, risked everything, for the chance to build something better. The envelope sat on the kitchen table like a small act of rebellion, waiting for morning and the courage to deliver it into a world that might finally recognize what Maria had always known, that strength came in many forms, and sometimes the most qualified candidate was the one who'd learned to succeed with nothing at all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of drizzle that made Seattle's glass towers look like they were dissolving into the gray sky. Maria stood at the bus stop, clutching Sophie's small hand while balancing a folder containing her life's most important documents and a diaper bag stuffed with quiet activities for a 5-year-old. The decision to bring Sophie hadn't been a choice, so much as a necessity. Mrs. Chen next door, who sometimes watched Sophie for a few hours, had fallen ill with the flu. The community centre's emergency childcare was full, and Maria couldn't afford the private daycare rates, even for a single morning. "Remember what we talked about," Maria whispered to Sophie as the bus approached, its brakes hissing against the wet pavement. "You're going to sit quietly and colour while Mama talks to the important people." Sophie nodded seriously, her backpack bouncing with the movement. Inside were 3 colouring books, a worn stuffed elephant named Peanut, and a juice box that represented Maria's entire beverage budget for the week. "I'll be super good, Mama, like a library mouse." The comparison made Maria smile despite her nerves. Sophie had developed this habit of creating elaborate metaphors for good behavior. Silent as a library mouse, still as a sleeping cat, invisible as air. It was both endearing and heartbreaking, this 5-year-old's sophisticated understanding of when to make herself small. The bus ride into downtown took 45 minutes, carrying them from their neighborhood of laundromats and corner stores into a world of gleaming offices and people in expensive coats. Maria watched the city transform through the rain-streaked windows, each block representing another step away from familiar territory. Sophie pressed her face against the glass, watching the buildings grow taller as they approached the financial district. "Mama, do people live in those tall houses?" "Some do," Maria replied, though she knew the towers they were passing housed corporations and law firms rather than homes. "But mostly people work there, in offices with big windows and important meetings." "Like where you're going?" "Exactly like where I'm going." Sterling Global's headquarters occupied an entire city block, its 47 floors of glass and steel reflecting the overcast sky like a mirror held up to heaven. The lobby was a cathedral of polished marble and soaring ceilings, with abstract art installations that probably cost more than Maria's annual income. Security guards in pristine uniforms stood behind a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that came from unlimited budgets and staff, whose only job was maintaining appearances. Maria approached the reception desk with Sophie's hand firmly in hers, trying to project confidence while internally cataloguing every way she didn't belong in this space. Her carefully pressed blouse and second-hand blazer suddenly felt inadequate, like costume jewelry trying to pass for diamonds. "I'm here for an interview," she told the receptionist, a polished woman in her 20s with perfectly straight teeth and a smile that seemed professionally maintained. "Maria Rodriguez, 11 o'clock appointment." The receptionist's fingers flew across her keyboard, manicured nails clicking against the keys with practiced efficiency. "Ms. Rodriguez, yes. You're here for the executive assistant position." Her gaze flickered to Sophie with barely concealed surprise. "I wasn't aware you'd be bringing—" "My daughter," Maria finished, her voice carrying a note of defensive pride. "I hope that won't be a problem. She's very well behaved." The receptionist's professional smile wavered slightly. "I'll need to check with HR about our policy regarding accompaniment to interviews." Maria felt the familiar burn of embarrassment creeping up her neck. She'd hoped to navigate this situation quietly, to simply explain if anyone asked directly. Now Sophie was being discussed like a complication, rather than the bright, observant child Maria knew her to be. "Please," Maria said quietly. "I wouldn't have brought her if I had any other option. She won't disturb anyone." The receptionist made a brief phone call, speaking in hushed tones while Maria and Sophie waited in the marble expanse of the lobby. Other people moved through the space with purpose and authority. Men in $1,000 suits, women in designer heels that clicked against the polished floor like declarations of belonging. Sophie tugged on Maria's hand. "Mama, everything here is so shiny, it's like a palace." It is like a palace, Maria agreed, squeezing her daughter's fingers. And we're visiting, so we need to be respectful guests. Okay to proceed, the receptionist announced, hanging up her phone. Take the elevator to the 35th floor. HR will meet you there. She handed Maria a visitor's badge with their names printed in neat block letters. The elevators are just past the security checkpoint. The elevator ride to the 35th floor felt like ascending through layers of corporate heaven. Each floor they passed represented another level of success, another tier of achievement that had previously existed only in Maria's imagination. Sophie watched the numbers climb with fascination, counting under her breath. The 35th floor opened onto a reception area that managed to be both elegant and intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the city below, while contemporary furniture created conversation areas that looked more like art installations than places where people actually sat. Ms. Rodriguez, a woman in her 40s, approached them, extending a perfectly manicured hand. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Senior HR Director. We spoke briefly on the phone. Jennifer's handshake was firm and professional, but Maria caught the subtle assessment in her eyes as she took in Sophie's presence. There was no overt disapproval, but there was surprise and perhaps a hint of concern about protocol. This is my daughter, Sophie, Maria said, deciding to address the situation directly. I apologize for bringing her, but I had an unexpected childcare situation. She's very quiet and won't interfere with the interview process. Jennifer crouched down to Sophie's eye level, surprising Maria with the genuine warmth in her voice. Hello, Sophie. That's a beautiful backpack. What do you have in there? Sophie's natural shyness warred with her curiosity about this friendly stranger. Coloring books and Peanut, she replied softly, hugging her backpack protectively. Peanut sounds like a very important friend, Jennifer said seriously. Would you like to see our family lounge while your mama has her meeting? We have books and quiet activities. Maria's relief was immediate and overwhelming. That's incredibly kind, but I don't want to impose. We actually have several employees who occasionally need to bring their children to the office, Jennifer explained, rising to her full height. It's not unusual, and we're equipped to handle these situations professionally. The family lounge was a revelation, a comfortable space with child-sized furniture, educational toys, and a small library of children's books. It was clear that Sterling Global, despite its corporate formality, understood that their employees had complex lives outside the office. There's a staff member here who can supervise, Jennifer assured Maria, as Sophie immediately gravitated toward a puzzle featuring farm animals. Sophie will be perfectly safe and entertained. As they left Sophie contentedly arranging puzzle pieces under the watchful eye of a friendly staff member, Maria felt a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. The fact that Sterling Global had a family lounge suggested they were more family-friendly than she'd expected, but it also raised the stakes of the interview. This wasn't just a job opportunity anymore. It was a glimpse into a world where work and family life could potentially coexist. Before we begin, Jennifer said as they walked toward the interview room, I want you to know that we were impressed by your application. Your responses were unconventional, but they demonstrated exactly the kind of creative problem-solving we value. Maria's pulse quickened. She'd assumed her honest answers would disqualify her immediately, but Jennifer's tone suggested something different. Thank you. I tried to be truthful about my experience, even if it doesn't look traditional on paper. Traditional experience can be overrated, Jennifer replied, stopping outside a conference room with glass walls. Sometimes the most valuable skills come from places we don't expect. The interview panel consisted of 3 people. Jennifer, a stern-looking man in his 50s, who introduced himself as the Chief Operating Officer, and a younger woman who served as the current executive assistant to one of the senior vice presidents. The questions began predictably. walking through Maria's resume, discussing her customer service experience, exploring her organizational abilities. But as the conversation progressed, something unexpected happened. Instead of focusing on what Maria lacked, the panel seemed genuinely interested in what she'd accomplished with limited resources. They asked detailed questions about her budgeting strategies, her crisis management during her mother's illness, her ability to maintain composure under pressure. Tell us about a time when you had to handle multiple competing priorities with insufficient resources, the COO asked, his stern expression softening slightly. Maria thought about the week her mother had been hospitalized, when she'd managed bedside vigils, Sophie's school schedule, work responsibilities and insurance paperwork while running on 3 hours of sleep and determination. She described the situation without self-pity, focusing on the systems she'd created to ensure nothing fell through the cracks. The current executive assistant leaned forward with interest. How did you maintain attention to detail under those circumstances? I learned that preparation was everything, Maria replied. If I laid out Sophie's clothes the night before, packed her lunch while cooking dinner, and kept a master calendar on the refrigerator, I could function even when I was exhausted. Small systems that prevented big problems. Jennifer made notes on her tablet, occasionally exchanging glances with her colleagues that Maria couldn't quite interpret. The questions continued for nearly an hour, covering everything from technology, skills to communication strategies to handling confidential information. One final question, the COO said, consulting his notes. This position requires discretion and emotional intelligence when dealing with high-stress situations and demanding personalities. Can you give us an example of how you've handled someone who was frustrated or upset? Maria thought immediately of Mrs. Patterson, an elderly customer at Miller's who'd come in every week to buy one item she didn't need because shopping was her only social interaction. The woman was often difficult, demanding and occasionally rude to other customers, but Maria had recognized the loneliness beneath the behavior. She described how she'd started setting aside a few minutes each week to really listen to Mrs. Patterson's stories, how she'd learned to anticipate the woman's needs and guide her toward purchases that would bring genuine satisfaction rather than impulse regret. Over time, Mrs. Patterson had become one of the store's most pleasant customers, simply because someone had taken the time to see her as a person rather than a problem. That's exactly the kind of insight we need, Jennifer said, closing her folder. Maria, we'll be making our decision this afternoon. Can we reach you at the number on your application? As they concluded the interview, Maria felt cautiously optimistic. The panel had seemed genuinely engaged with her responses, and their questions had allowed her to showcase strengths she'd never considered marketable. Walking back to collect Sophie, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong in this gleaming world of possibility. Sophie looked up from a completed puzzle when Maria entered the family lounge, her face bright with accomplishment. "Mama, look what I made! It's a whole farm with animals and everything." "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Maria said, kneeling beside her daughter. "Did you have fun?" "Miss Amy taught me about the fish in the big tank over there," Sophie said, pointing to an elaborate aquarium that Maria hadn't noticed before. "She said they swim in schools, but not the kind with books and teachers." Maria laughed, feeling some of the interview tension drain from her shoulders. "That's right. Different kind of school entirely." As they gathered Sophie's belongings and prepared to leave, Jennifer appeared in the doorway. "Maria, I wanted to thank you again for coming in today. We should have an answer for you by 5 o'clock. The bus ride home seemed longer than the morning journey, filled with Sophie's excited chatter about the tall building, the fancy elevator, and the nice lady who knew all about fish. Maria found herself torn between hope and practical caution, trying not to invest too much emotion in an outcome that remained uncertain. But as Seattle's familiar neighborhoods rolled past the bus windows, Maria realized something had already changed. For one morning, she'd been treated as a serious candidate rather than a charity case. She'd articulated her value in a professional setting and been heard, really heard, by people who understood that strength came in many forms. Whatever happened next, she'd proven something important to herself. She belonged wherever her courage was willing to take her. 47 floors above the interview room, where Maria had just finished presenting her unconventional qualifications, Michael Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his executive office, watching the afternoon rain paint abstract patterns across the glass. At 52, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from building an empire without losing sight of why he'd started. The Sterling Global Headquarters had been his vision made manifest, a testament to what was possible when innovation met determination. But lately, the gleaming towers and impressive quarterly reports felt hollow, like beautiful monuments to a life he'd forgotten how to live. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, breaking his contemplation. "Mr. Sterling, the quarterly board meeting has been moved to 3:30. Also, Jennifer Walsh from HR would like a moment when you're available." Michael pressed the response button, his attention still divided between the city sprawling below and the stack of acquisition reports demanding his review. "Send Jennifer up now and hold all calls until after the board meeting." Jennifer Walsh had been with Sterling Global for 8 years, rising through the ranks with a combination of sharp intelligence and genuine empathy that made her invaluable in human resources. When she knocked on Michael's office door 5 minutes later, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place at the executive table. "Michael, I wanted to brief you on something unusual that happened during today's executive assistant interviews," she began, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Michael glanced up from his reports, noting the thoughtful expression on Jennifer's face. In their years of working together, he'd learned to recognize when she'd encountered something that challenged standard corporate protocols. "Unusual how?" he asked, giving her his full attention. "We had a candidate today who brought her 5-year-old daughter to the interview. Maria Rodriguez, single mother, limited formal business experience, but—" Jennifer paused, searching for the right words. "Michael, I've conducted thousands of interviews, and I've never seen someone demonstrate such genuine leadership qualities while being completely honest about their limitations." Michael's eyebrows rose slightly. Bringing children to job interviews was certainly unconventional, but something in Jennifer's tone suggested this wasn't simply a matter of poor judgment or lack of options. "Tell me more," he said, pushing aside the acquisition reports entirely. Jennifer consulted her tablet, but Michael could see she didn't really need the notes. "Maria lost her job 8 months ago when the department store where she worked closed. She's been caring for her elderly mother, who passed away 3 months ago, raising her daughter alone, and somehow managing to maintain an incredibly positive outlook despite circumstances that would break most people." Michael found himself leaning forward, drawn by Jennifer's obvious enthusiasm for this candidate. "Her answers to our interview questions were unlike anything I've heard," Jennifer continued. Instead of trying to oversell limited corporate experience, she explained how managing a household budget had taught her financial precision, how coordinating her mother's medical care had developed her organizational systems, how working retail had given her insight into human psychology that most MBA programs never teach. "And the daughter?" Michael asked, though he was beginning to understand why Jennifer had been so affected by this interview. "Sophie, 5 years old, incredibly well-behaved, and clearly adores her mother." Jennifer's voice softened. "Michael, watching them together, it reminded me that some people build their entire lives around taking care of others, and that creates a kind of strength you can't learn in business school." Michael turned back toward the windows, processing this information while rain continued. its steady percussion against the glass. Something about Jennifer's description stirred memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Images of a different 5-year-old, a different kind of love, a different life that had ended too soon. "What's your recommendation?" he asked quietly. "Honestly, I think she'd be extraordinary in the right position. She has natural emotional intelligence, genuine problem-solving abilities, and the kind of work ethic that comes from necessity rather than ambition." Jennifer hesitated, but she doesn't have the traditional qualifications our clients expect. No college degree, no corporate background, no experience managing executive-level communications. Michael nodded, understanding the dilemma. Sterling. Global's reputation was built on providing clients with polished, highly credentialed professionals who could navigate the most demanding corporate environments. Hiring someone without traditional qualifications would be a significant departure from established protocol. "Where is she now?" he asked. "She should be getting our call within the hour." The panel was split. Everyone was impressed by her personally, but concerned about client perceptions. Michael made a decision that surprised even him. "Don't make that call yet. I want to meet her first." Jennifer's surprise was evident. "Michael, you never interview support staff directly. Are you sure that's necessary?" The question hung in the air while Michael considered his motivations. He could rationalize. It is due diligence on an unusual hiring decision, but the truth was more complex. Something about this story, a single mother bringing her child to an impossible interview, demonstrating grace under pressure while being completely vulnerable, had touched something in him that had been dormant for years. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning," he said firmly. "And Jennifer, make sure they know the daughter is welcome to come along." After Jennifer left, Michael remained at the windows, watching the city transform as afternoon faded into evening. His reflection in the glass showed a successful man in an expensive suit, surrounded by the trappings of achievement that most people spent their lives pursuing. But the reflection also revealed something else, the hollow expression of someone who'd gained the world while losing the parts of life that actually mattered. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife Sarah, a monthly reminder that some relationships couldn't survive the weight of shared grief. "Thinking of you today." Emma would have been 12. Michael closed his eyes, allowing himself a moment to remember the bright, curious little girl who'd been taken by leukemia 7 years ago. Emma Sterling, who'd loved bedtime stories and asked endless questions about everything, who'd seen magic in ordinary moments and made her father remember what wonder felt like. The divorce had followed 2 years later, not from lack of love, but from the impossibility of rebuilding joy on ground that had been scorched by loss. Sarah had wanted to try again, to create new life and new hope. Michael had buried himself in work, building Sterling Global into something magnificent and cold, achievement without purpose. He thought about Maria Rodriguez and her 5-year-old daughter, about the courage it took to risk rejection while protecting something precious, about the kind of strength that showed up to impossible interviews and answered honestly about limitations while quietly demonstrating extraordinary capability. That evening, Michael did something he hadn't done in years. Instead of staying late to review reports and prepare for meetings, he left the office at 6 o'clock and drove to Emma's grave in Riverside Cemetery. The headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." He sat in the damp grass, ignoring the way moisture seeped through his expensive suit, and told Emma about the woman he'd met only through Jennifer's description. About a little girl named Sophie, who colored quietly while her mother fought for their future. About courage that looked like showing up despite every odd being stacked against you. "I think you would have liked her," he said quietly to the headstone. "She sounds like she asks good questions and sees things differently, just like you did." The rain had stopped, and Seattle's evening sky was clearing to reveal stars that were usually hidden by city lights. Michael sat there until full darkness fell, making a decision that would change more lives than he could possibly anticipate. The next morning, Maria woke before dawn in their studio apartment, anxiety and hope warring in her chest like competing storms. The phone call from Sterling Global was supposed to come today, but she'd learned not to invest too much emotion in possibilities that might evaporate as quickly as they'd appeared. Sophie was still sleeping in their shared bed, her dark curls spread across the pillow like spilled silk. At 5, she was already showing signs of the resilience that circumstances had forced her to develop. The ability to adapt to new situations, to find joy in small moments, to trust that Mama would figure things out, even when the path forward wasn't clear. Maria made coffee with careful precision, measuring the grounds to ensure the single bag she'd bought would last another week. Through their small window, she could see the city beginning to wake up, delivery trucks navigating narrow streets, early commuters hurrying toward bus stops, the gradual transformation from residential quiet to urban energy. Her phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. "Ms. Rodriguez? This is Jennifer Walsh from Sterling Global. Do you have a moment to talk?" Maria's heart hammered against her ribs. "Yes, of course. We were very impressed with your interview yesterday, and we'd like to invite you back for a final conversation. Would you be available this morning at 11? Relief and terror flooded through Maria in equal measure. A second interview meant she was still in consideration, but it also meant another morning of hoping for something that might remain beyond reach. "Absolutely," she managed. "Should I bring anything specific?" "Just yourself," Jennifer replied, then paused. "And Maria? Sophie is welcome to join you again. We enjoyed meeting her yesterday." As Maria hung up the phone, Sophie stirred in bed, opening eyes that were bright with morning curiosity. "Was that the palace people, Mama?" "Yes, sweetheart. They want to meet with us again today." Sophie sat up, immediately alert. "Does that mean they liked you?" Maria gathered her daughter into a hug, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood and possibility. "I think it means they want to know us better. Are you ready for another adventure?" 2 hours later, they stood once again in Sterling Global's marble lobby, but this time Maria felt different. Yesterday had been about proving she deserved consideration. Today felt like something else entirely, an opportunity to discover what might be possible when courage met preparation. Jennifer met them at the elevator, but this time she wasn't alone. "Maria, Sophie, I'd like you to meet someone special. This is Mr. Michael Sterling, our company's founder and CEO." Maria looked up to see a tall man with silver-threaded hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore his authority quietly, like someone who'd learned that real power didn't need to announce itself. When he smiled at Sophie, something in his expression reminded Maria of fathers she'd seen at playgrounds, genuine warmth mixed with a sadness she couldn't quite identify. "Hello, Sophie," Michael said, crouching down to her eye level. "Jennifer tells me you're quite an artist. I heard you completed a very challenging puzzle yesterday." Sophie studied him with the serious attention she gave to all new adults, then smiled. It had horses and cows and a red barn. "Do you like puzzles?" "I love puzzles," Michael replied seriously, "especially the kind that seem impossible at first, but make perfect sense once you find the right pieces." As they rode the elevator to the executive floor, Maria felt like she was ascending through layers of possibility she'd never imagined accessing. Whatever happened in the next hour would change everything, but for the first time in months, she felt ready for transformation. Michael Sterling's executive office was a study in understated elegance, rich mahogany furniture, awards discreetly, displayed on built-in shelves, and panoramic windows that offered a commanding view of Seattle's skyline. But what caught Sophie's attention immediately wasn't the corporate grandeur. It was the small framed photograph sitting on Michael's desk, partially turned away from the seating area. "Please make yourselves comfortable," Michael said, gesturing toward a seating area with leather chairs arranged around a glass coffee table. "Can I offer you anything? Coffee, water, juice for Sophie?" Maria settled into one of the chairs, acutely aware that this informal meeting was anything but casual. CEOs didn't personally interview candidates for support positions unless something unusual was happening. Sophie, however, seemed completely at ease, her natural curiosity overriding any sense of intimidation. "Mr. Sterling," Sophie said, as she settled into the chair beside her mother, "your office is really high up. Can you see everything from here?" Michael's smile was genuine as he took the chair across from them. "I can see quite a lot. Sometimes I watch the boats in the harbor or the people walking in the park. What would you look for if you had a window?" "This high?" Sophie considered this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I think I'd look for other kids playing so I could wave at them. And maybe birds flying, because they must look different from up here." "That's very wise," Michael replied. "I never thought about waving at other children. That would make the view much more interesting." Maria watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. She'd expected a brief, formal conversation about job qualifications and corporate expectations. Instead, the most powerful man in the company was having an earnest discussion with her 5-year-old about office views and the social habits of birds. "Maria," Michael said, turning his attention to her while maintaining the same warm tone he'd used with Sophie. "Jennifer shared some details about your interview yesterday. I was particularly interested in your approach to problem-solving under pressure." "I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you directly," Maria replied, trying to match his conversational tone while her nerves screamed that this situation was far outside her experience. "I know my background isn't traditional for a corporate environment. Traditional is overrated," Michael said, echoing Jennifer's words from the day before. "Some of our most successful innovations have come from people who approached problems differently because they hadn't been taught there was only one right way." He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "Maria, I'm going to be direct with you. This position would be demanding in ways that go beyond typical executive assistant duties. You'd be working with clients who have very high expectations, managing confidential information that could affect millions of dollars in business decisions, and representing Sterling Global in situations where first impressions matter enormously." Maria felt her carefully constructed confidence wavering. "I understand, and I know I don't have the credentials that your clients probably expect to see." "What you don't have," Michael said carefully, "is the kind of polished corporate background that looks impressive on paper. What you do have is something much rarer, authentic leadership ability that comes from real-world experience." Sophie had been listening to this adult conversation with the patient attention children develop when they know important things are being discussed. But something about the tone, the careful way the grown-ups were talking around big concepts, made her fidget with the hem of her dress. "Mama," she said softly, "are you nervous?" The simple question cut through all the corporate politeness and professional positioning. Maria looked down at her daughter's concerned face and felt the familiar surge of protective honesty that parenthood demanded. "Yes, sweetheart, I am nervous, but sometimes we have to do scary things because they might lead to good things. Like when we moved to the new apartment after Grandma went to heaven." Maria's breath caught. Sophie's innocent reference to the most difficult period of their lives, moving from her mother's house to their tiny studio after the funeral, downsizing their entire world to fit their reduced circumstances, wasn't something she'd planned to discuss in this gleaming corporate office. "Yes," she said quietly, "like that." Michael had gone very still, his hands clasped in his lap as he watched this exchange. Something in Sophie's matter-of-fact mention of death and displacement had shifted the energy in the room, stripping away the professional veneer to reveal something more fundamental. "Sophie," Michael said gently, "can you tell me about your grandma?" Sophie's face brightened with the special joy children reserve for talking about people they love. "Grandma made the best pancakes in the whole world, and she taught me how to fold paper flowers. She was sick for a long time, but she still read me stories every night when she was staying with us." "She sounds wonderful," Michael said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood something about loss. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Sophie replied with the startling honesty of childhood. "But Mama says that loving someone means missing them when they're gone, and that's okay, because the love stays even when the person can't." Maria felt tears threatening, both from pride in her daughter's emotional maturity and from the raw vulnerability of having their private grief exposed in this most public of professional settings. Michael was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the windows. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than before. "Maria, can I ask you something personal? How do you do it? How do you maintain such strength and optimism when you've been through so much?" The question caught Maria off guard. She'd expected to discuss her qualifications, her availability, her salary expectations. She hadn't expected to be asked about the philosophical underpinnings of her survival strategy. "I don't think I'm particularly strong," she said slowly. "I think I just do what needs to be done, one day at a time, and Sophie gives me a reason to keep going when everything feels impossible." "But it's more than that," Michael pressed gently. "Jennifer told me about your interview answers, how you found positive aspects in every challenge, how you turned limitations into learning experiences. That's not just survival, that's leadership." Sophie had been following this conversation with increasing restlessness, sensing that something important was happening, but not understanding the adult complexity of the discussion. She slipped down from her chair and wandered toward Michael's desk, drawn by the photograph she'd noticed earlier. "Mr. Sterling," she said, standing on her tiptoes to get a better look. "Who's the little girl in the picture?" Michael's entire body went rigid. Maria looked toward the desk and saw what had captured Sophie's attention. A silver-framed photograph of a little girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile, probably taken at a birthday party or family celebration. "That's..." Michael's voice broke slightly. "That's my daughter Emma." Sophie studied the photograph with the intense focus she brought to anything that interested her. "She looks really happy. Does she live with you?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Maria felt her heart breaking for Michael, recognizing in his expression the particular pain of someone being asked to explain loss to a child's innocent inquiry. "No, sweetheart," Michael said quietly. "Emma died when she was 7 years old. She was very sick, and the doctors couldn't make her better." Sophie processed this information with the matter-of-fact acceptance children often show toward life's hardest truths. She looked at the photograph again, then at Michael's face, her small mind working through concepts that adults struggle to understand. "Were you very sad?" she asked softly. "Yes," Michael replied, his professional composure completely abandoned. "I was sadder than I thought it was possible to be." Sophie nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. Then she did something that no one in the room expected. She walked around the desk to where Michael was sitting and climbed onto his lap, wrapping her small arms around his neck in the spontaneous embrace that children offer when they recognize pain that needs comforting. "I'm sorry your little girl died," she whispered against his shoulder. "That makes me sad too." Michael's carefully controlled facade shattered completely. 7 years of suppressed grief, of forcing himself to function in a world that had lost its meaning, of building corporate monuments to fill the space where joy used to live, All of it came pouring out in silent tears that fell onto Sophie's dark curls. Maria watched in stunned silence as her 5-year-old daughter offered comfort to one of the most powerful men in the city, recognizing that some kinds of pain transcended age or status or circumstance. Sophie's intuitive compassion, her ability to see beyond surface differences to the fundamental human experience underneath, was doing something that years of therapy and well-meaning advice had failed to accomplish. "Thank you," Michael whispered against Sophie's hair, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." Sophie pulled back to look at his face, her small hands framing his cheeks with the gentle authority children possess when they're trying to fix something broken. "Do you think Emma would want you to be happy sometimes?" she asked, with the devastating directness that only children could manage. The question pierced through everything: the corporate success, the elaborate defenses, the careful distance he'd maintained from emotional connection since losing Emma. Sophie's simple inquiry demanded an answer that Michael had been avoiding for 7 years. "Yes," he said quietly, fresh tears spilling down his face. "I think she would want me to be happy." Sophie smiled then, the radiant expression of a child who'd successfully solved a complex adult problem. "Then maybe you could try being happy. Just a little bit at first. That's what Mama and I did after Grandma went to heaven. And in that moment, sitting in his high-rise office with a 5-year-old's arms around his neck and wisdom older than her years offering him permission to heal, Michael Sterling realized that some gifts arrived in the most unexpected packages. "Sophie," he said softly, "would you like to help me remember how to be happy?" "I'm really good at finding fun things," Sophie replied seriously. "Mama says I can find rainbows in puddles and adventures in grocery stores." Michael looked across the room at Maria, who was watching this extraordinary scene unfold with tears streaming down her own face. In her daughter's spontaneous compassion, in her own quiet strength, in the unexpected grace of this moment, he saw something he'd thought was lost forever: the possibility of building a life that honored the past while embracing the future. "Maria," he said, his voice steady for the first time since Sophie had asked about the photograph, "I'd like to offer you a position, not as an executive assistant, but as my chief of staff. And Sophie, I'd like to hire you as my official consultant on finding happiness in everyday things. Would you both be interested?" The office fell silent, except for the sound of 3 people breathing and the distant hum of a city continuing its business 47 floors below, completely unaware that everything had just changed. 3 weeks into Maria's new role as Chief of Staff, Sterling Global felt like a different company. Her approach to problem-solving had already streamlined several departmental processes, while Sophie's regular visits to the executive floor had become the highlight of many employees' weeks. The little girl's presence brought an unexpected warmth to the corporate environment, reminding everyone that work was just one part of a larger, more complex life. But success in the corporate world often breeds resentment among those who feel their territory threatened. Victoria Harrison had been Michael Sterling's executive vice president for 6 years, climbing the corporate ladder with calculated precision and unwavering ambition. At 45, she possessed the kind of polished competence that looked impressive in board meetings and intimidating in personnel reviews. She'd built her reputation on maintaining Sterling Global's elite image, ensuring that every employee, every client interaction, every public appearance reflected the company's position at the top of Seattle's business hierarchy. Maria's rapid ascension from unemployed single mother to chief of staff represented everything Victoria despised about modern corporate soft policies. In her view, business was about results, not feelings, and the sentimentality that had led Michael to hire an unqualified candidate threatened everything she'd worked to build. Victoria's office on the 42nd floor reflected her personality. Sharp angles, minimalist decor, and not a single personal photograph or warm touch. When she called Maria for a meeting on Friday afternoon, her tone carried the professional courtesy that barely concealed underlying hostility. "Maria, please have a seat," Victoria said, gesturing toward the uncomfortable chair positioned directly across from her imposing desk. "I wanted to discuss some concerns that have come to my attention regarding your transition into the Chief of Staff role." Maria settled into the chair, immediately recognizing the power dynamic Victoria was attempting to establish. The positioning, the formal tone, the careful choice of words, all designed to remind Maria of her place in the corporate hierarchy. "I appreciate your feedback," Maria replied carefully. "Is there something specific I can address?" Victoria opened a thick folder, her manicured fingers handling the documents with theatrical precision. "Several department heads have expressed concerns about protocol disruptions since your arrival, specifically the presence of your daughter in professional meetings, the informal management style you've introduced, and questions about whether your background adequately prepares you for executive-level responsibilities." Each word was chosen like a surgical instrument designed to cut with maximum precision while maintaining plausible deniability. Maria felt the familiar burn of imposter syndrome that had plagued her since accepting the position. But something in Victoria's tone triggered a different response, the protective instincts that came from recognizing a threat to her family's security. "Can you be more specific about these protocol disruptions?" Maria asked, her voice remaining steady despite the anger building in her chest. Victoria smiled, the expression managing to be both professional and predatory. "Well, for instance, yesterday's budget meeting with the Johnson account. Your daughter was present while we discussed confidential financial information. Our clients expect a certain level of sophistication from Sterling Global representatives. The criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth wrapped in unfair judgment." Sophie had been present during the meeting, quietly coloring it. A small table Michael had installed in the conference room specifically for such situations. She hadn't disrupted anything or shown any interest in the adult conversation, but Victoria was technically correct that it violated traditional corporate protocols. Sophie has been present for meetings only when absolutely necessary, and never during discussions of truly sensitive information, Maria replied. "Mr. Sterling approved these arrangements specifically because he values work-life integration." "Mr. Sterling's judgment has been questionable lately," Victoria said, leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone preparing to deliver a decisive blow. "Which brings me to the real reason for this conversation." She pulled a different set of documents from the folder, spreading them across the desk with practiced drama. "These are emails from 3 of our largest clients, expressing concerns about Sterling Global's recent direction, questions about whether we're maintaining our competitive edge, whether our executive team reflects the caliber of leadership they expect from a premier consulting firm." Maria glanced at the printed emails, noting the professional letterhead and formal language that suggested serious business concerns. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the implications. If major clients were questioning her presence, Michael's decision to hire her could damage the company's reputation and, bottom line, they're specifically concerned about the chief of staff position being filled by someone without relevant corporate experience, Victoria continued, her tone now carrying false sympathy. "Maria, I'm sure you're a lovely person, but this is about protecting Sterling Global's future. Some decisions need to be reconsidered before they cause irreparable damage." The attack was sophisticated in its cruelty, framed as concern for the company, while systematically undermining Maria's confidence and position. Victoria had clearly been building this case for weeks, gathering ammunition to present at precisely the right moment for maximum impact, "Have you discussed these concerns with Mr. Sterling?" Maria asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Michael is emotionally invested in his decision. Sometimes that prevents us from seeing situations clearly." Victoria's pause before "emotionally invested" carried clear implications about Michael's judgment being compromised by personal feelings rather than business acumen. Maria stared at the emails, trying to process their contents while simultaneously analyzing Victoria's motivations. The language was certainly concerning, but something about the timing felt orchestrated. Why would multiple clients suddenly develop reservations about a personnel decision that didn't directly affect their service? "Victoria, can I ask you something?" "Directly?" Maria said, meeting the other woman's gaze with newfound determination. "Are you trying to force me to resign?" Victoria's smile became more genuine, as if she appreciated having the game played openly. "I'm trying to help you recognize that some positions require specific qualifications, and that good intentions don't always translate into successful outcomes. This conversation is about finding a solution that works for everyone, including a solution that removes me from the company, including a solution that places you in a role more suited to your actual experience level. Perhaps something in customer service or administrative support where your background would be more appropriate." The offer was insulting in its transparent condescension, but Maria recognized it for what it truly was: a power play designed to remove her from proximity to Michael and restore Victoria's position as the primary influence on company direction. "I appreciate your concern," Maria said, standing to leave, "but I think these are conversations I should have directly with Mr. Sterling." Victoria's expression hardened, the professional mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "Maria, I've been trying to handle this delicately, but since you're choosing to be difficult, let me be clear. I have documentation of protocol violations, client complaints, and performance concerns that paint a very unflattering picture of your tenure here. If you force me to present this information to the board, it won't just affect your position. It will reflect poorly on Michael's judgment and decision-making capacity." The threat was unmistakable now. Victoria wasn't just targeting Maria's job, she was positioning herself to undermine Michael's authority by framing his hiring decision as evidence of compromised leadership. "Are you threatening Mr. Sterling's position?" Maria asked quietly. "I'm protecting this company from decisions that could damage our reputation and profitability. If that protection requires difficult conversations about leadership effectiveness, then that's what I'm prepared to do." Maria left Victoria's office with her mind racing, carrying printouts of the client emails and a growing suspicion that she'd just witnessed something more complex than simple workplace politics. Victoria's confidence, the perfectly timed documentation, the strategic escalation from personal criticism to threats against Michael, it all felt too coordinated to be spontaneous. That evening, after Sophie was asleep in their new apartment, a significant upgrade that Maria's salary had made possible, she spread the client emails across her kitchen table and began analyzing them with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to household budgets and medical insurance forms. The language patterns were remarkably similar across different companies. The timing of the complaints coincided precisely with Victoria's timeline for building her case. And most tellingly, the specific concerns raised suggested inside knowledge of boardroom discussions that wouldn't normally be shared with external clients. Maria reached for her laptop and began researching something that had occurred to her during Victoria's presentation. If these emails were legitimate client concerns, there should be corresponding patterns in Sterling Global's recent performance metrics, client satisfaction surveys, or account management reports. What she found instead was a paper trail that told a very different story. Sterling Global's client satisfaction ratings had actually improved since Maria's arrival. Account retention was up, Employee morale surveys showed significant positive changes, and several departments reported increased productivity. The metrics painted a picture of a company moving in precisely the opposite direction from the concerns expressed in the mysterious client emails. But more interesting was what Maria discovered when she cross-referenced the email domains with Sterling Global's client database. Two of the three companies that had supposedly expressed concerns about her presence weren't actually current clients. They were potential clients that Victoria had been courting for months without success. The third company was indeed a Sterling Global client, but their primary contact was listed as Victoria herself. The client concerns weren't independent complaints from worried business partners. They were fabrications designed to create a paper trail supporting Victoria's predetermined conclusion. Maria sat back in her chair, staring at the evidence spread before her. Victoria Harrison hadn't just been trying to force her resignation. She'd been manufacturing justification for a broader assault on Michael's leadership, using Maria as the vehicle for undermining his authority and positioning herself as the logical alternative. The sophistication of the scheme was impressive in its audacity. By framing Maria's hiring as a symptom of poor judgment, Victoria could argue that Michael's emotional state was affecting his business decisions. If she could force his removal or resignation, she'd be positioned to take control of Sterling Global with the apparent support of concerned clients and board members. But Victoria had made one crucial mistake in her calculation. She'd assumed that Maria would be intimidated by corporate politics and professional threats, that a single mother with no business experience would fold under pressure rather than fight back. Victoria had never encountered someone who'd spent years protecting a child from forces beyond their control. Someone who'd learned that survival sometimes required facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and creative problem-solving. Maria picked up her phone and scrolled to Michael's contact information. Tomorrow morning, she would walk into his office with documentation, analysis, and a plan for exposing Victoria's scheme. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of fierce satisfaction. She'd been underestimated before by employers who saw only her limitations, by a system that treated her as expendable, by circumstances that seemed designed to break her spirit. Each time, she'd proven that strength came in forms that weren't always immediately recognizable. Victoria Harrison was about to learn that threatening someone's family was the fastest way to discover exactly how strong they really were. Michael Sterling arrived at his office Monday morning to find Maria already waiting outside his door, clutching a thick folder and wearing an expression he'd learned to recognize over the past 3 weeks. The focused determination that preceded her most insightful observations about company operations. "Maria, you're here early," he said, unlocking his office door. "Everything all right?" "We need to talk," she replied quietly. "About Victoria Harrison, about the supposed client complaints, and about what's really happening at Sterling Global." Michael paused, his hand still on the door handle. In the weeks since hiring Maria, he'd noticed a subtle shift in the company's dynamics, particularly in how certain executives interacted with his decisions. Victoria's recent suggestions about reassessing organizational structure had struck him as unusually pointed, but he'd attributed it to normal corporate positioning. "Come in," he said, gesturing her into the office. "Can I get you coffee? You look like you've been up all night." Maria settled into the chair where Sophie had offered comfort just 3 weeks earlier, the folder balanced carefully on her lap. "I have been up most of the night, actually. Michael, I need to show you something, but first, I need to ask you a direct question. Have you seen any client complaints about my performance or presence in the company?" Michael's eyebrows rose. "No, none at all. In fact, I've received several compliments about improved efficiency and communication." "Why?" Maria opened the folder and extracted the printed emails Victoria had shown her. Because Victoria Harrison presented these to me Friday afternoon, claiming they were concerned feedback from major clients about my qualifications and the impact of my presence on Sterling Global's professional image. Michael accepted the documents, his expression growing increasingly serious as he read, "These are concerning. But Maria, I handle all major client communications personally, and I've never seen these before." "That's because they're fabricated," Maria said, producing her laptop and opening a spreadsheet she'd created during her all-night investigation. "I spent the weekend cross-referencing these emails with our actual client database, communication logs, and performance metrics." She walked him through her analysis with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to managing her mother's medical care. 2 of the 3 companies weren't current clients, the third was Victoria's own account, and the timing of all complaints coincided suspiciously with Victoria's recent suggestions about organizational changes. "Look at this," Maria continued, pulling up Sterling Global's internal performance data. "Client satisfaction is actually up 15% since I started. Employee engagement scores have improved across multiple departments. There's no objective evidence supporting any of these supposed concerns." Michael studied the data with growing amazement and anger. As CEO, he'd built Sterling Global on principles of transparency and ethical business practices. The idea that someone within his own executive team was manufacturing evidence to manipulate personnel decisions represented a fundamental betrayal of everything the company stood for. "Maria, this is serious corporate fraud. If Victoria is fabricating client communications to influence hiring decisions..." He trailed off, the implications becoming clear. "What exactly did she want from you?" "My resignation, initially. But when I refused, she escalated to threatening your position." Maria's voice remained steady, but Michael could see the tension in her shoulders. "She suggested that hiring me demonstrated poor judgment on your part, and that the board might need to reassess your leadership effectiveness." The pieces clicked into place with crystalline clarity. Victoria's recent private conversations with board members, her subtle questions about succession planning, her carefully voiced concerns about company direction, it had all been building toward this moment. "She's positioning herself for a takeover," Michael said quietly, "using your hiring as evidence that I'm making emotional rather than business decisions. That's my assessment. But Michael, there's something else." Maria hesitated, then forged ahead. "I think she's been planning this longer than we realize. I found several instances over the past 6 months where she's inserted herself into client communications without proper authorization, created documentation that doesn't match meeting notes, and positioned herself as the primary contact for accounts that should have reported directly to you." Michael stood and walked to his windows, processing this information while watching the city wake up below. In building Sterling Global, he'd focused so intensely on external threats and market competition that he'd overlooked the possibility of internal sabotage. Victoria's ambition, which he'd previously viewed as a corporate asset, had apparently metastasized into something more dangerous. "What do you recommend?" he asked, turning back to Maria. "We need more evidence before making accusations. Victoria is smart and careful. She's probably created plausible explanations for everything I've found so far." Maria closed her laptop. "But I have an idea. What if we let her think her plan is working?" Michael's expression sharpened with interest. "Explain." "Victoria expects me to be intimidated and resign quietly. Instead, what if I appear to be considering her offer while actually documenting her activities? If she believes she's winning, she might get careless and provide the evidence we need to expose her scheme completely." The strategy appealed to Michael's business instincts, but his protective feelings toward Maria and Sophie made him hesitate. "That could be dangerous. If Victoria realizes you're investigating her, she might escalate her attacks. I won't put You and Sophie at risk for the sake of the company." Maria smiled, the expression carrying echoes of every impossible challenge she'd overcome in the past year. "Michael? 3 weeks ago, I was unemployed and desperate, willing to bring my 5-year-old to a job interview because I had no other options. Victoria Harrison might be a corporate predator, but she's never had to choose between rent money and groceries. She's never had to explain death to a child or rebuild a life from nothing." She stood, gathering her folder with decisive movements. "I've been underestimated before, and it's always been their mistake, not mine. Victoria thinks she's dealing with an unqualified single mother who got lucky. She has no idea what she's actually up against." Michael felt a surge of admiration for Maria's courage mixed with concern for the risks she was proposing to take. "What do you need from me?" "Trust me to handle Victoria while you focus on protecting the company." "And Michael?" Maria paused at the door. "When this is over, we need to discuss how someone like Victoria was able to operate unchecked for so long. This isn't just about one bad executive. It's about systems that need improvement." After Maria left, Michael sat in his office contemplating the complexity of the situation. He'd hired Maria because of her problem-solving abilities and emotional intelligence, but he was discovering that her strategic thinking rivaled that of executives with decades of corporate experience. Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Victoria Harrison was conducting her own Monday morning meeting with 2 members of Sterling Global's board of directors. Robert Chen and Margaret Walsh had served on the board for over 5 years, and Victoria had cultivated relationships with both through careful attention to their concerns about company direction. "I appreciate you making time for this conversation," Victoria said, settling into the conference room she'd reserved for privacy. "I wanted to discuss some concerns about recent executive decisions and their potential impact on shareholder value." Robert, a venture capitalist in his 60s, leaned forward with interest. "This is about the chief of staff hire." "Among other things," Victoria replied, opening her own folder of carefully prepared documentation. "I've been monitoring client feedback and employee concerns since Maria Rodriguez joined the executive team, and the patterns are troubling." She presented her fabricated evidence with the same confidence she'd shown Maria, but tailored for an audience focused on financial performance and corporate governance. The fake client emails became warnings about lost business opportunities. Maria's family-friendly policies became evidence of lowered professional standards. Michael's emotional investment in his hiring decision became a symptom of compromised judgment affecting multiple business areas. "These are serious allegations," Margaret said, reviewing the documents with the attention of someone who'd served on multiple corporate boards. "Have you discussed these concerns with Michael directly?" "I've tried, but he's become defensive about criticism of his protégé." "Margaret, I've worked with Michael for 6 years, and I've never seen him so resistant to feedback or so willing to prioritize personal relationships over business objectives." Victoria's performance was masterful, presenting herself as the reluctant whistleblower forced to speak up for the good of the company. She'd learned to weaponize corporate governance language, framing her power grab as fiduciary responsibility. "What are you suggesting?" Robert asked. "I think we need a formal performance review of the Chief of Staff position with clear metrics and accountability measures. And I think the board should consider whether recent hiring decisions reflect the kind of strategic thinking we need at the executive level." The implications were clear without being explicitly stated. Victoria was laying groundwork for questioning Michael's leadership while positioning herself as the voice of reason and corporate responsibility. But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation in her strategy. She'd assumed that Maria would react to threats like a typical corporate employee, with fear, compliance, and a desire to avoid conflict. She had no understanding of the fierce protective instincts that drove someone who'd spent years fighting for survival. While Victoria presented her case to board members, Maria was 3 floors above, implementing a counter-strategy that would expose every lie, document every fabrication, and reveal the true scope of Victoria's betrayal. The battle for Sterling Global was about to begin in earnest, and both sides believed they held the advantage. By Tuesday afternoon, Victoria felt confident enough in her position to request a private meeting with Maria, ostensibly to discuss transition options, but actually to savor her anticipated victory. She'd received encouraging responses from the board members, who'd agreed to schedule a formal review of recent executive decisions. "Maria, thank you for making time," Victoria said as Maria entered her office. "I hope you've had a chance to consider our conversation from last Friday." "I have," Maria replied, settling into the uncomfortable chair with apparent resignation. "And you're right about some things. I am out of my depth in certain areas, and I don't want to damage Sterling Global's reputation." Victoria's smile was genuine for the first time in weeks. "I'm glad you're being realistic about the situation. So you're prepared to consider a transition to a more appropriate role?" "I think that might be best," Maria said quietly, "but I'd like to understand exactly what evidence you'll be presenting to Mr. Sterling and the board. If I'm going to step down, I want to ensure the reasoning is clear and well documented." Victoria's eyes gleamed with triumph. "Of course. Transparency is important in these situations." She spent the next 20 minutes walking Maria through her fabricated case, sharing details about board communications, timeline strategies, and the specific language she planned to use in formal presentations. In her eagerness to demonstrate her superior planning and corporate sophistication, Victoria revealed the full scope of her scheme. Maria listened with apparent defeat, asking clarifying questions and taking notes that Victoria interpreted as acceptance of inevitable professional failure. What Victoria didn't realize was that Maria was documenting every false claim, every fabricated timeline, every piece of evidence that could be used to expose the conspiracy. "I think this approach is very thorough," Maria said as Victoria concluded her presentation. "You've clearly put a lot of thought into protecting the company's interests." "I have," Victoria agreed. "And Maria, I want you to know this isn't personal, it's just business." "I understand," Maria replied, standing to leave. "Just business." But as Maria walked back to her office, she was thinking about something Sophie had said the night before while they read bedtime stories. "Mama, why do some people think being mean makes them strong?" It was a good question, and Maria was about to provide Victoria Harrison with a very comprehensive answer. The Sterling Global boardroom on the 46th floor was designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows offering commanding views of Seattle's financial district, and portraits of the company's founding executives watching from gilded frames. By Thursday morning, it had become the arena where Victoria Harrison planned to claim her victory. 5 of the 7 board members were present for the emergency session Victoria had requested, citing urgent concerns about executive leadership and fiduciary responsibility. Michael sat at the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral as he listened to Victoria's presentation, while Maria occupied a chair along the wall, present as the subject of discussion, but not invited to participate in the proceedings. "In summary," Victoria concluded after 20 minutes of polished corporate rhetoric, "we're facing a situation where emotional decision-making has superseded sound business judgment. The appointment of an unqualified chief of staff represents a pattern of concerning choices that demand board oversight." Robert Chen, the venture capitalist, reviewed the fabricated client emails one final time. "These are indeed troubling communications. Michael, how do you respond to these documented concerns from major clients?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered his response. For the past 3 days, he'd watched Maria gather evidence with the methodical precision of a detective building an airtight case. Now, sitting in this boardroom listening to Victoria's lies presented as corporate gospel, he felt a cold anger that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with fundamental principles of honesty and integrity. "Robert, those are excellent questions," Michael replied calmly. "But before I address the client communications, I'd like to share some information that I think will provide important context for our discussion." Victoria's confidence wavered slightly. This wasn't the defensive response she'd anticipated. Michael activated the room's presentation screen and began displaying a series of documents that Maria had compiled over the past week. "These are our actual client satisfaction metrics for the past month. As you can see, ratings have improved across every category since Maria joined our executive team." The board members leaned forward, studying charts that showed unmistakable positive trends in customer retention, service quality assessments, and account growth. "Furthermore," Michael continued, "I've personally contacted every client mentioned in the emails Victoria shared. Interestingly, 2 of the 3 companies aren't actually our clients. They're prospects that we've been pursuing unsuccessfully for several months. The 3rd company, when reached directly, expressed surprise about the alleged complaints and confirmed they've been quite satisfied with our recent service improvements." Victoria's face had gone pale, but she maintained her professional composure. "Michael, I'm sure there are explanations for these discrepancies. Perhaps the client communications came through informal channels, or—" "Victoria," Michael interrupted, gently, "the explanations are actually quite simple. The emails you presented to this board, and to Maria last Friday, are fabrications. They were never sent by our clients. They were created to support a false narrative about company performance and executive decision-making." The boardroom fell silent. Robert Chen's expression shifted from concern to something approaching shock, while Margaret Walsh began reviewing the documents Victoria had provided with the sharp attention of someone recognizing they'd been manipulated. "That's a serious accusation," Victoria said, her voice carrying a note of wounded indignation. "I would never compromise my integrity or the company's interests by misrepresenting client communications." "I'm sure you wouldn't," Michael agreed. "Which is why I've asked our IT department to conduct a forensic analysis of the email headers, metadata and origin servers for the communications in question." On cue, Jennifer Walsh entered the boardroom accompanied by Sterling Global's Chief Technology Officer, David Park, who carried a laptop and a folder thick with technical documentation. "David, would you please share your findings with the board?" Michael requested. David connected his laptop to the presentation system and began displaying technical analyses that transformed Victoria's carefully crafted lies into indisputable evidence of fraud. Email headers showing creation dates that contradicted supposed sending dates. IP addresses tracing back to Sterling Global's internal servers. Metadata revealing the documents had been created using Victoria's executive account during non-business hours. In summary, David concluded, these communications were generated internally using sophisticated document editing software, then formatted to appear as legitimate external emails. The technical evidence clearly indicates deliberate fabrication designed to mimic authentic client correspondence. Victoria's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous. You're conducting a witch hunt based on technical speculation and—" "Victoria." The voice came from Maria, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, but now stood with the quiet authority of someone who'd reached the end of their patience. "Stop talking!" The simple command, delivered without raising her voice, carried such conviction that even Victoria fell silent. Maria walked to the front of the room, her folder of evidence open in her hands. For the past week, I've been documenting not just these fabricated emails, but a pattern of deception that goes back months. Victoria, you've been systematically positioning yourself to undermine Michael's authority while building a case for your own leadership succession. She began presenting evidence with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to managing crisis after crisis in her personal life. Documentation of unauthorized client communications, records of board conversations that Victoria had initiated without Michael's knowledge, financial irregularities in accounts under Victoria's direct supervision. But the most telling evidence, Maria continued, came from Victoria herself during our meeting on Tuesday. She was so confident in her scheme's success that she shared details about timeline strategies, board manipulation tactics, and specific language she planned to use in formal presentations. Maria activated her phone's recording app and played audio that captured Victoria's voice, describing her fabricated evidence and strategic planning in her own words. The board members listened in stunned silence as Victoria's recorded confession revealed the full scope of her conspiracy. "You recorded our conversation without my consent," Victoria said, desperation creeping into her voice. "That's illegal surveillance and inadmissible as evidence." "Actually," Maria replied with a slight smile, "Washington State is a two-party consent state for recording conversations. I clearly informed you at the beginning of our Tuesday meeting that I would be recording our discussion for documentation purposes. You agreed to proceed with full knowledge that our conversation was being captured." Robert Chen looked at Victoria with the expression of someone realizing they'd been thoroughly deceived. "Victoria, is there anything you'd like to say in response to this evidence?" Victoria looked around the boardroom, recognizing that her carefully constructed plan had collapsed. Completely. The fabricated emails, the board manipulation, the character assassination, all of it had been exposed with ruthless efficiency by the woman she'd dismissed as an unqualified single mother. "I was protecting this company," she said finally, her voice lacking conviction. "Michael's judgment has been compromised by personal relationships and emotional decision-making. Someone needed to ensure that Sterling Global maintained its competitive standards. By lying to the board, fabricating client communications, and attempting to orchestrate a corporate coup." Margaret Walsh's tone carried the sharp disapproval of someone who'd served on multiple boards and recognized serious governance violations. "I was ensuring that qualified leadership remained in place," Victoria replied, but her words sounded hollow even to herself. Michael stood, his expression reflecting a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Victoria, effective immediately, you're terminated from Sterling Global. Security will escort you from the building, and we'll be referring this matter to appropriate authorities for investigation of potential criminal fraud." As if summoned by his words, 2 security officers appeared at the boardroom door. Victoria gathered her belongings with as much dignity as she could manage, but before leaving, she turned to Maria with an expression of pure venom. "You think you've won something here, but you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. This corporate world will chew you up and spit you out, and when it does, don't expect anyone to save you." Maria met Victoria's gaze with calm confidence. "Victoria, I've survived poverty, discrimination, single parenthood, and watching my mother die while trying to raise a child alone. Do you really think corporate politics are going to break me?" The question hung in the air as Victoria left, flanked by security, her 6-year climb to executive power ending in disgrace and legal jeopardy. After the boardroom cleared, Michael and Maria stood alone among the scattered evidence of Victoria's defeated conspiracy. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where so many important decisions had been made. "Maria," Michael said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I hired you because I recognized your capabilities. But I didn't provide adequate protection against this kind of internal threat. That was a failure of leadership on my part." Maria shook her head. "Michael, you couldn't have anticipated this level of deception. And honestly, dealing with Victoria taught me something important about corporate dynamics that I needed to understand, which is that success in business isn't just about competence or hard work. It's about recognizing that some people will always try to use your perceived weaknesses against you. The key is making sure they underestimate your actual strengths." Michael smiled, recognizing the wisdom in her observation. "Victoria certainly underestimated yours." "She made the same mistake a lot of people make," Maria replied, gathering her documents. "She confused circumstances with character. She saw a single mother who needed help and assumed that meant I was weak or desperate. She never considered that someone who'd survived everything I had might actually be stronger than someone who'd never faced real adversity." As they prepared to leave the boardroom, Michael realized that the day's events had accomplished something beyond simply exposing Victoria's fraud. They demonstrated that his decision to hire Maria hadn't been emotional impulse or charitable gesture. It had been sound business judgment based on recognizing qualities that traditional corporate metrics couldn't measure. "Maria, there's something I want to discuss with you," he said as they reached the elevators. "This position was originally structured as chief of staff, but I think we need to consider expanding your role. Your strategic thinking and crisis management skills are exactly what Sterling Global needs as we continue growing. What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time Sterling Global had a chief operating officer who understands that real leadership comes from a lot of different places. Are you interested in a promotion?" As the elevator doors opened, Maria thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate unemployment to executive leadership in less than 2 months. But more importantly, she thought about Sophie, who was probably in the family lounge downstairs, teaching other children about paper flowers and farm animals and the secret lives of office-building fish. "Yes," she said, stepping into the elevator with a smile that carried echoes of every impossible challenge she'd overcome. "I'm very interested." The elevator descended toward the ground floor, carrying them away from corporate battlefields and toward a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few weeks earlier. 6 weeks after Victoria Harrison's dramatic exit from Sterling Global, Maria Rodriguez found herself standing in the lobby of the Seattle Convention Center, watching hundreds of small business owners stream through the entrance for the inaugural Sterling Global Community Enterprise Summit. The event had been her idea, a free conference designed to provide resources, networking opportunities, and educational workshops for entrepreneurs who typically couldn't afford high-end business consulting services. "Mama, look how many people came!" Sophie's excited voice carried across the registration area as she helped volunteer staff distribute welcome packets. At 5 years old, she'd become something of a mascot for the summit, charming attendees with her earnest questions about their businesses and her own elaborate plans to open a zoo library restaurant when she grew up. Michael approached them through the crowd, his expression carrying the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing an ambitious vision translate into tangible impact. "Maria, the registration numbers are incredible. We had to open additional workshop sessions to accommodate demand." "It's amazing what happens when you remove barriers instead of creating them," Maria replied, watching a grandmother register for a social media marketing workshop while her teenage granddaughter translated the forms into Spanish. Victoria was right about one thing. This isn't how Sterling Global traditionally operates, but maybe that's exactly why it's working. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of transformation that extended far beyond simply replacing Victoria's position. Maria's promotion to Chief Operating Officer had coincided with a fundamental reimagining of Sterling Global's community engagement philosophy. Instead of exclusively serving Fortune 500 clients, the company had launched initiatives designed to democratize access to professional business consulting. The Community Enterprise Summit was just one piece of a broader strategy that included free monthly workshops, sliding-scale consulting fees based on business size, and mentorship programs connecting established entrepreneurs with emerging ones. Critics in the business community had questioned whether these charitable activities would damage Sterling Global's premium brand positioning, but the results spoke for themselves. Client satisfaction ratings had reached all-time highs as existing. Customers responded positively to working with a company that demonstrably cared about community impact. Employee engagement scores had skyrocketed as staff members found renewed purpose in their work. Most importantly, the community programs had generated unexpected business opportunities as grateful small business owners referred larger companies to Sterling Global's traditional services. "Ms. Rodriguez?" A young woman approached Maria tentatively, carrying a worn notebook and wearing the expression of someone summoning courage for an important conversation. "I'm Jenny Chen. No relation. To the board member," she added with a nervous laugh, "I just wanted to thank you for making this event possible." Maria extended her hand warmly. "Please, call me Maria. And thank you for being here. What kind of business are you working on?" Jenny's face lit up with the enthusiasm of someone finally given permission to share their passion. "I'm trying to start a catering company specializing in fusion cuisine. My grandmother's Korean recipes combined with local Pacific Northwest ingredients, but I've been struggling with the business plan and permit requirements." "That sounds absolutely fascinating," Maria replied, genuinely interested. "Have you had a chance to attend any of the workshops on regulatory compliance or financial planning? I'm signed up for 3 sessions this afternoon. But honestly, just being in this room with other people who understand what it's like to build something from nothing, it's incredible." Jenny's voice carried the emotion of someone who'd felt isolated in their entrepreneurial dreams. Sophie tugged on Maria's sleeve, having overheard enough of the conversation to spark her curiosity. "What's fusion cuisine?" Jenny crouched down to Sophie's eye level, her nervousness disappearing as she explained the concept of combining different cooking traditions to create new flavors. Within minutes, she was describing her grandmother's kimchi recipe, and Sophie was suggesting that zoo animals might enjoy Korean Pacific Northwest fusion food. Michael watched this interaction with growing amazement. In the corporate world he'd inhabited for decades, networking events were carefully choreographed affairs where conversations followed predictable patterns focused on immediate business value. But Maria's approach had created something entirely different, authentic connections between people who saw business as an extension of community rather than separate from it. "Maria," he said quietly, as Jenny and Sophie continued their animated discussion about restaurant design, "I've been thinking about something. This summit, the community programs, the way you've transformed our company culture, it's accomplished more in 6 weeks than some of our traditional strategies achieved in years." "Thank you. But I think the success comes from listening to what people actually need, instead of assuming we know what's best for them," Maria replied. Victoria spent so much energy maintaining artificial barriers between qualified and unqualified clients that she never noticed how much talent was being overlooked. Michael nodded, but his expression suggested he was working toward a larger point. "I've been approached by several other companies asking about consulting on similar community engagement initiatives. And yesterday, I received a call from the Seattle Business Journal requesting an interview about our innovative approach to corporate social responsibility." "That's wonderful. Recognition like that can only help expand the programs. It is wonderful, but it's also made me realize something important. Michael's tone grew more serious. Maria, what we've built here is bigger than just Sterling Global. The model you've created, removing barriers, democratizing access to professional services, treating community impact as business strategy rather than charity. It could transform how companies think about their role in society. Maria felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with apprehension. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to think beyond one company's community programs. What if we created a non-profit organization dedicated to replicating this model in other cities? What if we developed a framework that other businesses could adopt to create similar impact in their own communities? The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Maria had barely adjusted to her role as COO of one company. The prospect of scaling their approach nationally represented an entirely different level of responsibility and complexity. Michael, that's an incredible vision, but I'm not sure I have the experience to lead something that ambitious. Non-profit management, national scaling, policy development, those are areas where my background is still pretty limited. Your background is exactly what makes this possible, Michael replied firmly. You understand what it feels like to be excluded from opportunities, to face barriers that have nothing to do with your capabilities. That perspective is what created these programs in the first place. Before Maria could respond, Sophie had finished her conversation with Jenny and bounded over to join the adult discussion. Mama, Jenny says she's going to send us samples of her Korean-Mexican fusion tacos when her business opens. Can we try them? Of course, sweetheart, Maria replied, smoothing Sophie's hair with the automatic gesture of maternal affection. But what did you think about her business idea? Sophie's expression grew serious in the way that always preceded her most insightful observations. I think she's really smart and her food sounds delicious, but she seemed sad about not having enough. Help! Why don't more people help people start businesses? The question, delivered with 5-year-old directness, cut straight to the heart of everything they'd been discussing. Maria exchanged glances with Michael, recognizing that Sophie had inadvertently articulated the fundamental problem their programs were designed to address. That's a very good question, Maria told her daughter. What do you think we should do about it? Help more people, obviously, Sophie replied with the confident simplicity of childhood logic. If helping one person makes them happy and their business helps other people, then helping lots of people would make lots of people happy. Michael laughed, the sound carrying genuine delight. Sophie, I think you just provided the best argument for non-profit expansion I've ever heard. As the afternoon progressed, Maria found herself observing the summit with new eyes, seeing not just a successful one-day event, but the foundation for something potentially transformative. Workshop attendees were already forming informal support networks, exchanging contact information and discussing collaboration opportunities. Small business owners who'd arrived feeling isolated were leaving with mentors, partners, and renewed confidence in their entrepreneurial dreams. During the closing session, Maria took the microphone to address the full gathering. Looking out at hundreds of faces representing dozens of different industries, backgrounds, and stages of business development, she felt the familiar surge of protective determination that had carried her through every impossible challenge. 6 months ago, she began, I was unemployed, desperate, and convinced that opportunities like this didn't exist for people like me. I thought business success required connections I didn't have, credentials I couldn't afford, and knowledge that was somehow reserved for other people. The room fell silent, recognizing the authenticity in her voice. What I've learned is that business success requires the same qualities that help you survive adversity: creativity, persistence, the ability to solve problems with limited resources, and the courage to keep trying when everything seems stacked against you. Those aren't skills you learn in MBA programs. They're skills you develop by living life, facing challenges, and refusing to give up on your dreams. She gestured toward the audience, her voice growing stronger. Everyone in this room has those skills. You've demonstrated them by starting businesses, by showing up today, by believing that your ideas and efforts can create something valuable. Our job at Sterling Global isn't to judge whether you're qualified for success. It's to provide tools and support that help you build the future you're already working toward. The applause was immediate and sustained, but Maria barely heard it. She was thinking about Sophie's question, about Jenny Chen's grateful expression, about the dozens of conversations she'd witnessed throughout the day between people discovering they weren't alone in their entrepreneurial struggles. After the event concluded and the convention center began to empty, Maria found herself sitting in the quiet lobby with Sophie, both of them exhausted but energized by the day's success. "Mama," Sophie said, leaning against her mother's shoulder, "are you going to help start businesses in other places too?" The question confirmed what Maria had been thinking all afternoon. Michael's vision for national expansion wasn't just an ambitious business opportunity. It was a logical extension of everything they'd already proven possible. "I think so, sweetheart. Would you like to help me figure out how to help people start businesses in lots of different cities?" Sophie nodded solemnly. "I have good ideas about making people feel welcome, and I know how to find fun things, even when grown-ups are talking about boring business stuff." Maria hugged her daughter closer, realizing that once again the path forward was being illuminated by the intersection of practical necessity and unexpected possibility. 6 months ago, she'd been fighting just to survive. Now, she was contemplating how to transform the entire landscape of entrepreneurial support. But the most remarkable part wasn't the scope of the opportunity. It was the recognition that every skill she'd need for this new challenge was something she'd already developed through the simple act of refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. The Sterling Global Community Enterprise Foundation was about to be born, and with it, a new model for how business success could create community transformation rather than simply individual wealth. 2 years later, Maria Rodriguez stood at the podium of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., looking out at an audience of 2,000 entrepreneurs, business leaders, and policymakers gathered for the National Small Business Innovation Summit. The woman who had once brought her 5-year-old daughter to a desperate job interview was now being introduced as the keynote speaker and founder of the Sterling Global Community Enterprise Foundation, which had replicated their Seattle model in 47 cities across the United States. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conference moderator announced, "please welcome Maria Rodriguez, whose innovative approach to democratizing business consulting has transformed how we think about entrepreneurial support and community development." The applause filled the vast auditorium, but Maria's attention was drawn to the front row, where 7-year-old Sophie sat beside Michael Sterling, both of them beaming with pride. Sophie wore a small business badge that read Chief Happiness Officer, a title she'd requested when the foundation formally added her as their youngest advisor on creating welcoming environments for families. "Thank you," Maria began, her voice carrying the confidence that came from speaking to audiences who genuinely wanted to hear what she had to say. "2 years ago, I was a single mother facing eviction, unemployment, and the heartbreaking choice between paying rent and buying groceries. I brought my 5-year-old daughter to a job interview because I had literally no other options." She gestured toward Sophie, who waved enthusiastically at the audience. "That little girl taught me something that day that has shaped everything we've accomplished since. She showed me that the qualities we need to succeed in business, authenticity, compassion, resilience, and the courage to keep trying when everything seems impossible, those aren't corporate skills. They're human skills The audience leaned forward, recognizing the authenticity in Maria's presentation. Unlike many keynote speakers who relied on polished success stories, Maria was sharing the raw truth of transformation earned through struggle. The Sterling Global Community Enterprise Foundation has now provided support to over 12,000 small businesses, created 43,000 jobs, and generated $400 million in economic activity. But those numbers, impressive as they might be, don't tell the real story. Maria clicked to the next slide, which showed photographs from community summits across the country, diverse faces representing every kind of entrepreneurial dream imaginable. The real story is Jenny Chen, who started with a catering business, serving Korean Pacific Northwest fusion cuisine from her grandmother's kitchen, and now operates 3 restaurants that employ 37 people. The real story is Marcus Washington, a formerly homeless veteran who created a construction company specializing in affordable housing and has built homes for over 200 families. She continued through a series of success stories, each one representing not just individual achievement, but ripple effects that had strengthened entire communities. The teenage single mother who developed a childcare app that now served 40,000 families. The laid-off factory worker who'd created a manufacturing cooperative that had brought sustainable jobs back to a Rust Belt city. But perhaps the most important story, Maria said, is about what happens when we stop treating business success as a zero-sum game and start recognizing it as community building. The slide changed to show economic impact data from cities where the foundation operated, job creation rates, small business survival statistics, and community development indicators that painted a picture of transformation extending far beyond individual companies. Traditional business consulting focused on helping the already successful become more successful. We decided to focus on removing barriers that prevented capable people from accessing opportunities they'd earned through their skills and determination. Michael watched from the front row, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The foundation's success had exceeded every projection, but more importantly, it had proven that business could be a vehicle for social transformation rather than simply wealth accumulation. The model had attracted attention from international development organizations, policy think tanks, and academic institutions studying inclusive economic growth. Harvard Business School had created a case study of their approach. The United Nations had invited Maria to present at their conference on sustainable development goals, but Michael knew that for Maria, the real validation came from moments like the previous evening, when they'd had dinner with Jenny Chen at one of her Seattle restaurants. Jenny had told them about the culinary scholarship program she'd established for immigrant women, funded by profits from her business success. The question we face now, Maria continued from the podium, is whether we're willing to scale this approach beyond individual programs and foundations. Are we ready to fundamentally rethink how we define business success and corporate responsibility? She clicked to a slide showing the Foundation's new initiative, the National Inclusive Business Alliance, a coalition of companies committed to adopting community-focused practices as core business strategies rather than charitable add-ons. We've proven that treating community impact as business strategy rather than corporate charity produces better outcomes for everyone involved. Companies that participate in our network show higher employee satisfaction, stronger customer loyalty, and more sustainable long-term growth than their traditional competitors. The audience included CEOs of major corporations who'd initially been skeptical of Maria's approach, but had gradually recognized its effectiveness. Several had quietly implemented pilot programs based on the Foundation's model, discovering that inclusive practices enhanced rather than compromised their competitive positioning. But systemic change requires more than individual company initiatives. Maria continued. It requires policy frameworks that support inclusive business practices, educational systems that teach entrepreneurship as community development, and financial structures that recognize the long-term value of sustainable, equitable growth. She outlined the Foundation's newest ambitious project, working with congressional representatives to draft legislation that would provide tax incentives for companies demonstrating measurable community impact, fund inclusive entrepreneurship, education in public schools, and create low-interest loan programs for businesses committed to hiring from underserved communities. Some people will tell you this is idealistic, Maria said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd spent years proving skeptics wrong. They'll say business and social responsibility are fundamentally incompatible, that profit motives inevitably conflict with community welfare. She paused, looking directly at Sophie, who was listening with the serious attention she brought to all-important adult conversations. My daughter once asked me why some people think being mean makes them strong. It's a good question, and after 2 years of building inclusive business networks, I think I have an answer. Some people confuse competition with destruction, success with dominance, and strength with the ability to exclude others. The auditorium was completely quiet now, recognizing that Maria was building towards something significant. But real strength comes from lifting others up. Real success creates opportunities for everyone, and real leadership means recognizing that our individual achievements are meaningless unless they contribute to something larger than ourselves. Maria clicked to her final slide, which showed a simple photograph of Sophie helping register attendees at the very first Community Enterprise Summit in Seattle. This little girl taught me that business success isn't about proving you're better than other people. It's about creating environments where everyone can discover and develop their own unique capabilities. It's about building communities where children grow up believing that their dreams are achievable, regardless of their family's circumstances. She stepped closer to the edge of the stage, her voice growing more personal. 2 years ago, I was facing impossible odds with nothing but determination and the support of someone who chose to see potential instead of limitations. Today, I'm asking all of you to make similar choices. Look around your companies, your communities, your industries. Find the people who are working twice as hard for half the recognition. Find the entrepreneurs who have great ideas but limited access to resources. Find the workers who've been overlooked because they don't fit traditional definitions of professional qualifications. The energy in the auditorium had shifted, becoming something between inspiration and challenge. And then do what Michael Sterling did for me. Provide an umbrella in the storm, not because it's charitable, but because it's smart business. Not because it makes you feel good, but because it creates the kind of sustainable, inclusive growth that benefits everyone. Maria concluded with words that would be quoted in business schools and policy discussions for years to come. The future of business isn't about competing for limited opportunities. It's about creating unlimited opportunities through collaboration, innovation, and the recognition that every person's success strengthens the entire community. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Maria's attention was focused on Sophie, who was clapping enthusiastically while whispering something to Michael. When the applause finally subsided, Maria invited questions from the audience. A Fortune 500 CEO raised his hand. Ms. Rodriguez, the model you've described sounds wonderful in theory, but how do we address shareholders who are primarily concerned with quarterly profits rather than long-term community impact? Maria smiled, recognizing a question she'd answered dozens of times. By demonstrating that community impact drives long-term profitability, companies in our network consistently outperform their competitors in customer retention, employee satisfaction, and sustainable growth metrics. The question isn't whether shareholders can afford to invest in inclusive practices. It's whether they can afford not to. A young woman in the back raised her hand. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start a business, but feels like they don't have the right background or connections? Start anyway, Maria replied without hesitation. The most successful entrepreneurs I know didn't wait until they felt qualified. They started with what they had, learned what they needed, and built connections through authentic relationships rather than networking strategies. Your background isn't a limitation. It's your unique perspective on problems that need solving. After the formal session ended, Maria joined Michael and Sophie for a quiet dinner at a restaurant near their hotel. Sophie, now 7 and even more observant than she'd been at 5, had spent the day taking notes in a small notebook she decorated with drawings of happy business people. "Mama," she said over dessert, "I liked your speech, but I have a question." "What's that, sweetheart? When you help people start businesses, do you ever get sad that you can't help everyone who needs help?" The question caught Maria off guard with its insight. "Sometimes I do feel sad about that, but then I remember that every person we help becomes someone who can help other people. It's like dropping stones in a pond. The ripples keep spreading, even after the stone disappears." Sophie nodded solemnly, making a note in her notebook. "So helping one person is really helping lots of people, just slower." Exactly. Michael watched this exchange with the familiar amazement he felt whenever Sophie distilled complex concepts into simple truths. "Sophie, what are you writing in that notebook?" "Ideas for making business help even better," she replied seriously. "Like having special areas for kids at business meetings and making sure all the forms are written so people can understand them, and maybe having food trucks at business conferences so people don't get hungry while they're learning." Maria laughed, recognizing that her daughter's suggestions weren't childish whims, but practical insights into creating more inclusive, accessible business environments. "Those are excellent ideas," Michael said. "Would you like to present them at our next Foundation board meeting?" Sophie's face lit up. "Really? I can talk to the board about my ideas?" "Absolutely. Some of our best innovations have come from unexpected perspectives." As they walked back to their hotel through the Washington, D.C. evening, Maria reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, she'd been a desperate single mother, willing to risk everything for the chance to provide a better life for her daughter. Tonight, she was returning to a hotel suite as the founder of a national foundation that had transformed thousands of lives. But the most remarkable part wasn't the external transformation. It was the recognition that every skill she'd needed for this journey had been developed through the simple act of refusing to give up when giving up would have been easier. "Mama," Sophie said as they reached their hotel, "do you think Emma would be proud of what we built?" The question referred to Michael's daughter, whose memory had become an honored part of their extended family story. Maria looked at Michael, seeing the complex emotions that always accompanied mentions of Emma. "I think Emma would be very proud," Maria replied. "And I think she'd especially love that we found ways to help families stay together while building successful businesses." Michael nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Emma always believed that the best adventures were the ones where everyone got to come along. I think she'd approve of what we've created." As they rode the elevator to their floor, Sophie announced her intention to design business cards for her Chief Happiness Officer position, complete with drawings of smiling entrepreneurs and rainbow-colored profit charts. Maria hugged her daughter closer, thinking about the long journey from that desperate morning when she'd brought Sophie to an impossible interview, not knowing that the most powerful man in the city had lost his own child and was waiting for someone to remind him how to hope again. 3 simple words, "I'm sorry your little girl died," had opened a door that led to transformation none of them could have imagined. But the real magic hadn't been in those words themselves. It had been in Sophie's instinctive understanding that some pain needed comfort, some dreams needed support, and some chances needed to be given to people who'd never had chances before. The Sterling Global Community Enterprise Foundation continued to grow, expanding into international markets and developing new models for inclusive economic development. But its heart remained the same simple principle Sophie had demonstrated that day in Michael's office. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is recognize someone else's pain, offer authentic comfort, and believe that better things are possible. And sometimes, when you're brave enough to show up as yourself, scared, imperfect, and hoping for the best, you discover that your vulnerability becomes someone else's strength, your struggle becomes someone else's inspiration, and your willingness to keep trying becomes the foundation for changes that ripple far beyond anything you ever imagined possible. The story that began with a humble mother bringing her daughter to a CEO interview had become a movement that proved business success and community transformation weren't just compatible. They were inseparable parts of building a world where everyone's dreams had room to grow. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.